Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, your heart pounding in your chest, convinced that something was watching you? My name is Dorian Hale, and I'm not someone easily shaken. I've spent years photographing the most desolate, forgotten places on Earth. Places where shadows seem to move on their own, and whispers follow you when no one else is around. But what I'm about to share with you is unlike anything I've ever experienced. It wasn't just a dream, it was something much darker. It began innocently enough, with a vivid nightmare, but the line between reality and the dream world soon blurred. I've tried to forget it, to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Yet, the same figure still appears, lurking in the corners of my vision, following me wherever I go. Before we dive into the details of this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. You won't want to miss what's coming next, because the mysteries I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you think you know about the world around you. If you dare to continue, brace yourself, because sometimes the real nightmare doesn't begin until you wake up. It started on a night like any other. I drifted into sleep, but this time, the dream was different. I found myself in a grand ballroom, but there was something off. The chandeliers above flickered with a sickly yellow light, casting long, twisted shadows across the room. The walls were lined with dusty, tattered curtains, and though the air should have been filled with the lively chatter of a party, there was only a deafening silence. The smell hit me first, an overpowering scent of rot and decay, like something had been festering just beneath the surface for centuries. As I moved through the room, I heard a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging slowly across the floor, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't find the source. The guests were all masked, their faces hidden behind ornate coverings of gold and silver, their eyes lost in shadow. They stood eerily still, like statues, their heads slightly tilted, as if waiting for something or someone. As I walked deeper into the room, a sense of déjà vu washed over me. I felt like I had been there before, though I knew I hadn't. There was an unsettling familiarity in the way the floorboards creaked under my feet, in the smell of the place, in the way the dim light reflected off the polished surfaces of the masks. It was as if I had stepped into a place that had been waiting for me, a place that knew me, even if I didn't know it. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The warmth of the ballroom faded, and a cold, biting air wrapped itself around me. My breath became visible, small clouds of mist in the unnaturally frigid space. That's when I noticed the masks turning, ever so slowly, following my movements with their hollow eyes. A cold sweat ran down my back as I realized I was no longer alone. A figure, taller than the others, stood at the far end of the room. Its mask was different, simple, featureless, with two dark holes where the eyes should be. It wasn't watching me like the others. No, it was waiting, and somehow I knew it had been waiting for me for a long time. Every instinct told me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The floor beneath me felt sticky, like it was trying to hold me in place. The scraping sound returned, louder this time, closer. I glanced down and saw what looked like cracks forming in the wooden floor, but they weren't cracks. They were dark, jagged shapes, like fingers creeping toward me. My heart pounded in my chest, and just as I opened my mouth to scream, the lights went out. When the lights flickered back on, the ballroom was no longer the grand, decaying space it had been moments before. The guests were gone, and the once elegant room had transformed into something far more sinister. The walls now appeared cracked and crumbling, the floor coated in a thin layer of dust that seemed to swirl unnaturally, as if moved by an invisible breeze. Shadows stretched along the walls, twisting and elongating in ways that defied logic. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The eerie silence was broken only by the faint ticking of an unseen clock, slow, deliberate, like the countdown to something I didn't want to face. As I tried to regain control, I noticed that the objects in the room had shifted. Chairs were overturned, tables had been pushed into strange, unsettling formations, and the grand chandelier above me swung gently, as if something had disturbed it. Every few seconds, I could have sworn the furniture changed position when I wasn't looking. It was subtle, like the room itself was alive, shifting just out of sight. My skin crawled as I realized the room wasn't just empty. It was waiting for me. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The masked figure. It stood motionless at the far end of the room, half shrouded in shadow, its featureless face somehow more terrifying in the dim light. The black eye holes of its mask seemed to follow me, even though the figure hadn't moved. My throat tightened as I tried to speak, but no sound came out. There was something wrong about it. Something deeply, profoundly unnatural. It didn't feel like a person beneath the mask. It felt like something else. Something ancient. Something malevolent. As I stepped backward, trying to distance myself from the figure, a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it the faint scent of burnt wood and something metallic, blood maybe. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an exit, but every door I had seen before was now gone. There was no way out, just me and the figure. And then I noticed it. The shadows on the walls began to move, writhing like serpents, reaching for me. They twisted and contorted, forming shapes that resemble hands, long, bony fingers grasping at the air. The clock's ticking grew louder, faster, as if time itself was running out. Desperate, I turned toward the only remaining door at the far end of the ballroom. It was slightly ajar, and a faint, eerie light spilled from the gap. I didn't want to open it, but something deep inside me knew I had to. The masked figure hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence intensify, as though it was silently urging me to open that door. My heart raced, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but my feet moved on their own, pulling me toward the door. The room seemed to contract around me, the shadows pressing closer, suffocating me. With trembling hands, I pushed the door open, the light inside blinding for a moment. What I saw beyond that door is something I will never forget. As I stepped through the door, the light dimmed, revealing a small, windowless room. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with a smell so overpowering that it turned my stomach, mold, decay, and something far worse, like death lingering in the corners. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single flickering candle, was an old, cracked mirror. Its surface was covered in a fine layer of dust, but even from where I stood, I could see something moving just beneath it. My heart pounded in my chest as I inched closer, drawn to the mirror despite the overwhelming dread filling every part of me. As I stared into the glass, I saw my reflection, but something was off. My reflection moved slower, almost as if it were lagging behind, mimicking my actions with a delay. My breathing quickened, and I felt the walls of the room closing in, trapping me in this claustrophobic space with that warped version of myself. And then, out of nowhere, the figure appeared. In the reflection, it stood just behind me, its mask as smooth and expressionless as ever, its dark eyeballs locked onto mine through the mirror. I spun around, but there was no one there. Only the emptiness of the room. My hands trembled as I turned back to the mirror, and this time, my reflection didn't move. It stood still, staring at me, with the masked figure now standing directly beside it. I tried to move, to back away, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. My reflection's eyes, my own eyes, began to darken, sinking into hollow voids that mirrored the blackness of the figure's mask. I wanted to scream, but my throat tightened, choking me. The figure in the reflection raised its hand, placing it on my reflection's shoulder, and at that moment, I felt a cold, skeletal touch on my own. The room plunged into darkness, the candle flickering out in an instant. I was trapped, alone in the pitch black, with the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. But then, there was a noise, a faint, rasping breath, not my own. It was coming from right behind me. I froze, every muscle in my body paralyzed with fear. I could hear it getting closer, the sound of slow, deliberate steps approaching from the shadows. And then, I felt it, the cold, icy breath against the back of my neck, followed by the soft scrape of fingers brushing against my skin. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. Suddenly, the darkness was pierced by a blinding flash of light. I was no longer in the small room. I was back in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely think. For a moment, I believed it was all over, that it had been just a nightmare. But as I lay there, catching my breath, the same overwhelming smell of decay lingered in the air. My eyes darted to the clock on my bedside table. It read 3:33 a.m., just like in the dream. And then, from the far corner of the room, I heard it, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like nails on the floor. I wasn't alone. The figure from the dream, it had followed me back. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the dream. It clung to me like a shadow, invading my thoughts at every moment. The smell, the masked figure, the mirror, it all felt too real, too vivid to simply be dismissed as a nightmare. I kept waking up at 3:33 a.m., drenched in sweat, my ears still ringing with the faint sound of scraping. My room felt different now, as if the very air had thickened with the weight of something unseen. There was a coldness in the corners, a subtle presence that I could feel watching me, though whenever I looked, nothing was there. I knew I couldn't just leave it behind. I needed answers. Driven by an inexplicable need to understand what was happening, I began researching old mansions, mirrors, and strange occurrences tied to masked figures. I scoured the internet, dug through archives, and even visited local libraries, searching for any clue that could explain my dream. And then, after days of fruitless searching, I found something. A forgotten article buried in the depths of an obscure historical website. It was about a mansion, a once grand estate on the outskirts of town, abandoned for decades. The article described it as the site of a tragic masquerade ball that had ended in disaster in the early 1900s. Guests had vanished without a trace, their bodies never found, but locals spoke of seeing strange figures lurking near the estate long after. The part that sent a chill down my spine was the description of the figure. Survivors had reported seeing a tall, faceless man in a simple, featureless mask, just like the one from my dream. According to the article, the figure was said to appear in the dreams of those who visited the mansion, luring them back to the site of the massacre. The more I read, the more the pieces began to fall into place. The masked figure wasn't just a creation of my mind. It was something ancient, something tied to the mansion, waiting for the right person to see it. Desperate for more information, I reached out to local historians, asking if they knew anything about the mansion or the masked figure. That's when I stumbled upon an old woman named Clara, who claimed to know the truth. I met her in a dimly lit cafe, and she spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid that the figure might hear her. Clara told me that the mansion had always been a place of darkness, long before the masquerade tragedy. She mentioned stories of people vanishing after being drawn there by their dreams, their minds overtaken by something they couldn't escape. But the detail that shook me to my core was her description of a mirror. Clara said that there was a cursed mirror in the mansion, one that trapped the souls of those who gazed into it for too long. Those who saw the masked figure were said to have been marked, chosen to cross the boundary between dreams and reality, pulled into a place they could never return from. My blood ran cold as she spoke, because I knew. I had looked into that mirror in my dream. The masked figure had already marked me. Clara warned me to stop searching, to leave it all behind before it was too late. But how could I? The dream was real. The mansion was real. And I had to go there. I needed to know what awaited me within those crumbling walls. Despite Clara's warnings, I couldn't stop. The mansion had become an obsession, pulling me deeper with each passing day. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, whispering in my ear, daring me to return. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the urge grew. I could feel it in every corner of my life. The sensation of being watched, the creeping cold that followed me, even in the brightest moments of the day. At night, the dreams intensified. The masked figure appeared more frequently, standing closer each time, its presence suffocating, its hollow aisles drawing me in. There was no escaping it anymore. I had to go back to where it all began. One overcast afternoon, I made my way to the mansion. It stood like a decaying giant at the edge of a forgotten forest, its windows shattered, and its once grand facade now crumbling into ruin. The air around it was different, thick with an unnatural silence, as if the world itself held its breath in the presence of the estate. I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Something inside me was pushing me forward, a force far beyond my control. As I crossed the threshold into the mansion, the temperature plummeted. My breath formed small clouds in the stale air, and the floorboards groaned under my weight, as if protesting my presence. The interior was worse than I imagined. Dust coated every surface, the remains of tattered furniture scattered about like the remnants of a long-forgotten past. The smell was overwhelming, mildew, rot, and something far darker, like the scent of time itself decaying in the walls. Every corner of the mansion felt alive with a quiet malevolence, and as I ventured deeper, I could feel the house watching me, listening, waiting. The first sign that I wasn't alone came as I entered the ballroom, the same one from my dream. The room was eerily identical, down to the cracked chandeliers and the twisted, flickering light. But there was something else. A sound, soft, almost imperceptible at first, but unmistakable. The faint scrape of something sharp dragging across the floor, coming from just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the shadows, twisting and contorting in ways that made my skin crawl. The scraping sound grew louder, echoing through the empty halls, but no matter where I looked, I couldn't find the source. Then, from the far end of the ballroom, I saw movement. A figure stepped out from the shadows, a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, as if she had seen something beyond the realms of sanity. She introduced herself as Ava, another person drawn to the mansion by dreams she couldn't explain. She had been coming here for weeks, searching for answers, just like me. Her voice trembled as she spoke of the masked figure, of how it had appeared to her in dreams and visions, always watching, always waiting. She had seen it in her waking life, too, standing in mirrors, lurking in the corners of her vision, just as it had for me. Together, we explored the mansion, our footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The deeper we went, the stronger the presence became. We could feel it, that malevolent force, growing with every step, feeding off our fear. Ava confessed that she had been hearing whispers, faint voices calling her name, urging her to follow them. I hadn't heard the voices yet, but I could sense the same pull, a gnawing dread that burrowed deeper into my mind the longer we stayed. As we ventured into the heart of mansion, the shadows seemed to close in around us, moving just out of sight, but always there, watching, waiting. It was then that we found it, the mirror from my dream. It was hidden in a forgotten room at the end of a narrow hallway, its surface cracked and warped. The moment we laid eyes on it, we knew. This was the source. The masked figure, the dreams, the overwhelming sense of dread, it all led back to this cursed object. But as we stood there, staring into the dark glass, something shifted in the air. The room grew impossibly cold, and a deep, guttural whisper echoed from behind us. We turned, but there was nothing, just the shadows, thick and suffocating. Ava and I knew we were no longer alone. The masked figure was close, too close, and there was no turning back now. The room was deathly silent, save for the faint ticking of an unseen clock, a rhythmic beat that seemed to echo in my skull. Ava and I stood frozen before the cracked mirror, its dark surface swirling as though something beneath it was alive, shifting. The air felt thick, as if the room itself was suffocating us, pressing down on our chests, making it hard to breathe. My eyes darted to the reflection in the mirror. There it was, the masked figure, standing just behind us, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. But when I turned to face it, there was nothing. The room was empty, or so it seemed. Ava's hand trembled as she reached for my arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her eyes wide with terror. I nodded, my throat tight. We both felt it, the cold, creeping presence that filled the space around us. It wasn't just in our heads, it was real. The masked figure was here, watching us, waiting for something. But what? My heart raced, and I could hear the faint scraping again, the sound of something sharp dragging along the floor, closer and closer. Suddenly, the mirror cracked again, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. A thin web of fractures spread across the glass, and from the deepest, darkest part of the mirror, the figure began to emerge. Its movements were slow, deliberate, as though it was peeling itself out of the glass, becoming more solid with each passing second. My legs were rooted to the spot, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The figure was towering now, its mask gleaming in the dim light, the featureless face somehow more terrifying in its emptiness. Its long, bony fingers reached out toward me, and I could feel the air around me grow colder, thick with the scent of death and decay. Ava screamed, the sound cutting through the suffocating atmosphere like a knife. She turned to run, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, sealing us inside. We were trapped. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time, it spoke, though its mouth never moved. The voice was a low, guttural whisper, filling the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You've seen me," it said, its voice hollow, empty, like the wind passing through a graveyard. "You cannot escape." My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a frantic drum against the silence. Ava backed away, her eyes darting around the room, desperate for an escape. But there was none. The shadows in the room seemed to move on their own, stretching toward her, twisting and writhing like living things. The figure's presence grew stronger, darker, and I could feel it pulling at my mind, trying to drag me into the same endless void that had claimed the others. That's when I noticed it, an old book lying on a nearby table, its leather cover cracked and worn with age. It was open, and on its pages was a symbol I recognized immediately. It was the same symbol I had seen in my dreams, the one that had appeared in random places throughout my life. I didn't understand its meaning, but I knew it was important. Without thinking, I lunged for the book, grabbing it and holding it out in front of me like a shield. The masked figure froze, its hollow eyes locking onto the symbol. For the first time, I felt a shift in the air, like a flicker of hesitation, a moment of weakness. Ava saw it too. "The book," she yelled, her voice shaking. "It's the key." The figure's presence seemed to waver, and for a split second, I thought we might have a chance. But then, the figure moved again, faster this time, and I felt its icy fingers brush against my skin. A cold, unbearable pain shot through my body, and my vision blurred. The shadows closed in, wrapping around me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I could hear Ava screaming, but her voice grew distant, muffled, as though I were sinking underwater. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the figure's mask, staring down at me, its empty eyes filled with the promise of something far worse than death. When I opened my eyes again, I was in a hospital bed. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air, and the steady beeping of a heart monitor echoed in the room. My head throbbed, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it all came rushing back, the mansion, the mirror, the masked figure. I tried to sit up, but pain shot through my body, and I collapsed back onto the bed. The doctors told me I had been found unconscious in the middle of the mansion's ballroom, with no signs of injury. They couldn't explain how I had gotten there, or what had happened. But I knew the masked figure wasn't done with me. The dreams had started again, and this time, they felt even more real. The symbol from the book appeared everywhere, in my room, in the hospital hallways, even etched into my skin. And every night, at 3:33 a.m., I heard the scraping sound closer and closer as the figure came for me again. The days that followed were a blur of fear and confusion. After I was released from the hospital, nothing felt the same. The world outside seemed dull, like it had been drained of color, while shadows stretched impossibly long in the corners of my vision, always lurking, always moving. No matter where I went, I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on me, a constant, invisible presence that never left. The masked figure had followed me from the mansion, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it came for me again. The nights were the worst. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in mansion, standing in front of the cracked mirror, watching as the figure emerged from the darkness. The dreams felt more vivid now, more real, as if I wasn't dreaming at all, but slipping into another world, a world where the rules of reality no longer applied. Every night, without fail, I woke up at exactly 3:33 a.m., my heart pounding in my chest, the sound of that infernal scraping echoing through my room. I would lie there, frozen, unable to move, my eyes locked on the darkest corner of the room, where I knew it was watching me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed, determined to confront whatever it was that had latched onto me. But as I stood in the middle of my room, the air grew cold, and I saw it. The symbol from the book, etched into the wall, glowing faintly in the dark. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers brushed against the surface, a sharp pain shot through my hand. I jerked back, my skin burning, and when I looked down, the symbol had appeared on my palm, like it had been branded into my flesh. Panicking, I searched for answers, diving deeper into the mansion's history, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening to me. That's when I discovered the truth. The mirror wasn't just a cursed object. It was a gateway, a portal to something far darker than I could have imagined. The masked figure wasn't a ghost or a spirit. It was a guardian of the mirror, bound to it, forever hunting those who had seen beyond the veil of reality. Those who looked into the mirror were marked, chosen to be dragged into its world, where time didn't exist and escape was impossible. The more I uncovered, the more I realized there was no way out. The figure had already claimed me, and was only a matter of time before it would take me fully. I tried to warn Ava, but I couldn't find her. She had disappeared without a trace, just like the others who had come before us. I feared the worst, that the figure had already taken her, pulled her into the mirror's world, where she would be trapped forever. As the days went on, I noticed the symbol appearing in more places, carved into the trees outside my window, drawn in the condensation on the bathroom mirror, even appearing in the random patterns of cracks in the sidewalk. It was everywhere, a constant reminder that the figure was always watching, always waiting. And then, one night, something changed. It was 3:33 a.m. I woke to the sound of the familiar scraping, louder this time, like it was coming from just outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, paralyzed with fear, listening as the sound grew closer until it was right outside. The door creaked open, ever so slowly, and in the dim light, I saw it, the masked figure, standing in the doorway, its hollow eyes staring directly at me. But this time, it wasn't just watching. It was coming for me. I tried to move, to scream, but my body refused to obey. The figure stepped into the room, its movements slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. Its long fingers reached out, the same cold, skeletal touch I had felt before. But this time, there was no escape. It leaned in close, and I could feel its breath, cold and damp, against my skin. My vision blurred as the figure whispered something in my ear, a single word that sent a chill down my spine. Soon. And then it was gone. The room was empty again, but the mark it left behind was undeniable. I was no longer just a visitor in its world. I was a part of it now, bound to the mirror, to the figure, to whatever dark force controlled it. The symbol on my hand burned brighter than ever, and I knew that time was running out. So now I leave you with a question. Was it all just a dream? Or is there something far more sinister at play? Something that's been watching me, and maybe you, from the shadows all along? If you've ever felt that cold breath on your neck, or heard the sound of nails scraping in the darkness, maybe you've already been marked too. Maybe the figure is already watching you, waiting for the moment to strike. So before you close your eyes tonight, think about this. What if your nightmares aren't just dreams? What if they're warnings? If you want to know more, subscribe, leave your theories in the comments, and share this story with others. Maybe together, we can find a way to stop the figure before it comes for us all, before the clock strikes 3:33 again.